Hello everyone, my name is Jordan Mathis, and this is a presentation I've made for ESD 300, Citizenship, Social Values and Ethics and Sustainability for the University of Gothenburg. The presentation I'm going to give today is called Learning Agonism, Narratives of Migration in Upper Secondary Swedish Schools. The background of this project is inspired by the fact that we have a so-called migration crisis going on right now in Europe and its borders, especially in between Greece and Turkey. There's a huge humanitarian crisis, primarily dealing with Syrian refugees trying to make their way to seek asylum in Europe. And of course, this is a major area of social sustainability. Documents like the New York Declaration, signed in 2016, clearly show that we need to incorporate displaced people and refugees in our development measures if we're ever going to achieve any kind of real sustainable change for the Millennium Goals and the social sustainability goals. Basically, I want to be looking at the following question: how can migrant narratives be used in civic education to further social sustainability? That's kind of the research question that this activity is designed around. And then one other additional note, I'm going to be using narratives both as a tool of analysis and a learning outcome. I want students to be able to make their own narratives and identity positions, which I'll come back to in a little bit. So now I'm going to talk just a little bit about the theoretical considerations that inform this project. Broadly speaking, this lesson was designed with Nussbaum's capabilities approach. That's to say, specifically the capability of affiliation that she outlines, the ability to affiliate or turn towards the other. Certainly in this case, it would be the refugee, the immigrant, the person from outside. And then more technically speaking, the framework that I'm using is borrowed from political thinker Chantel Mouffe, her concept of agonist narratives, which is backgrounded in her understanding of conflictual mode of society, meaning that societies are always going to be forming transient identity positions, and the idea that there must be an us, and for there to be an us, a collective identity, there has to be a them. Likewise, I'm going to be using the idea of hegemonic discourses, and that identity positions are shaped through hegemonic discourses, and Mouffe's understanding of complementary yet contesting discourses being that in advanced democratic societies, when you have very similar centralist right and left political ruling, these discourses fail to provide valid alternative identity positions, and then they maintain the existing hegemony. And I think it's a real interesting place to explore, because Mouffe has actually never commented on immigration, despite the fact that she's regarded as a major political thinker in Europe and has commented on a vast array of European politics. This represents kind of an interesting gap to explore. So looking at the current political situation, Hansen has done some really interesting work to apply Mouffe's ideas about European political identity discourse to popular media representations of immigrants. He recognizes that, of course, on the right-hand populist movement, you're given a narrative of the immigrant as a threat to the nation state. However, the same side of the coin, on the other hand, you have this humanitarian narrative which sees the immigrant as a victim and calls upon the citizen as a good Samaritan to come to the rescue of the immigrant. Ultimately, this humanitarian narrative, according to Mouffe and Hansen, fails to provide a convincing enough identity alternative to the neo-nationalist right-wing narrative, and thus it upholds the hegemonic order. And we can see that in examples of Brexit and La Front National and all of these right-wing populist movements. And to represent that, I've given you an image from a political ad from Alternative for Deutschland, this right-wing race neo-nationalist party with a very Orientalist image there for their advertisements. And on the other hand, you have the young boy who drowned in summer of 2015, coming from Syria, trying to make his way to for refugee in Europe. And that image sparked a whole humanitarian wave of sentiment that was very short-lived, because shortly after 2015, the next year, most European countries closed their borders to Syrian refugees and made it much more difficult to seek asylum there. So the question is, what is an agonistic narrative? And an agonistic narrative is basically one that can destabilize this hegemonic identity position and help marginalized groups overcome the they versus us dichotomy, and basically, according to Chantel Mouffe, create greater political plurality and alliances between oppressed peoples. In this particular case, I think transnational literature does just that. Transnational literature, especially when it's first-hand accounts, narrativizing struggles, journeys of travel, gives the story, the migrant, an authenticity about for their oppression. Transnational literature oftentimes deals with themes of identity, crisis, language loss, marginalization, but also it often these narratives conclude with some kind of measures to take autonomy. So above all, it highlights the immigrant as an autonomous being, a human being, which is very, very important. I think it's not good to prescribe one title, because you need to recognize that immigrant groups will be very, very diverse and coming from different places. So I've included two here. One is by an Italian Somalian author, and the title is called Auda by Egabe Skego. And another title, which of course would be really relevant in Sweden, I think, is from a Finnish-Swedish author, Ingen har bett mig att komma, or No One Asked Me to Come, by Antti Jalava. And I think it really could be good to have a mix of older generation immigrant literature, transnational literature from Sweden, as well as new European migrant fiction, to kind of create this bridge and realize and create solidarity between these two migrant groups. So how do these ideas get incorporated into an education plan? Well, starting with the target group, it makes most sense to teach this kind of education activity to Swedish teenagers in upper secondary school for two reasons. It's going to require individuals that have a pretty advanced capability of abstract reasoning. Thus, teenagers are really the lowest level you could probably do this lesson for. And then second of all, teenagers are the closest to become voters. They're still open to new ideas. So politically, it makes sense given the threat of these right-wing nationalist populist parties. I'm going to talk a little bit about the learning outcomes. Basically, the learning outcomes for this activity is that students create agnostic narratives themselves, or that is, they are challenged to create alternative identity positions to the prevailing hegemonic discourses of immigrant as threat or immigrant as victim and helpless. In practical terms, this learning activity will follow a few steps. It'll begin with a values discussion about democracy and how the students see these fundamental aspects of democracy, manifesting themselves in the immigration situation today in Europe. They'll begin reading a transnational fictional title that the teacher chooses to be relevant to the class. I think a comparative media analysis would be really useful here, where they take a piece of news, take a piece of media, see if some of these discourses are present, and then compare them with a grassroots movement called Jag är 2015, or I Am 2015. It's a Facebook group which has new Swedish people, newly arrived Swedish people, mostly from Syria, that are young and have successfully integrated. They're sharing their own personal migration tales of struggle and triumph. And then finally, the students, after they've completed these other tasks, would actually go out into the community and interview an immigrant that they may or may not know. It could be a first-generation immigrant. It could be a second-generation immigrant. They would be challenged to ask them questions about their journey, but ultimately the teacher should provide them with some questions that would facilitate understanding, trust, and cultural and experiential exchange. That's kind of the idea that with these activities, they should be able to create a real human figure behind these narratives, which they're really being fed in the media. Finally, wrapping things up, I'd like to discuss some final considerations. Of course, when doing an education activity like this, one always has to remember that refugee journeys are a possible terrain of trauma and bringing up personal reflections of their journeys. Needs to be done quite delicately. Therefore, it's advisable to maybe coordinate with a community leader first in order to help facilitate these interview dialogues. Then another consideration is, as Hansen mentions, the application of such an antagonistic approach to narratives of migration provides a really good platform for unsettling these hegemonic neo-nationalist identity discourses in Europe. However, it's to be expected that teachers who believe in the neutrality of education may shy away from such activities of discussing hegemony, power relations, and social constructions. As an answer to that, one can certainly cite the Dutch philosopher Geert Willems when he points out that education is a theological practice, and it's always going to be done with performed with a purpose in mind anyways. Value-laden learning in this regard is really impossible, because when we teach, we always engage with some kind of prevailing societal norm. Freire has said also something very similar to this. It's oftentimes cited that choosing to avoid critical approaches to education is also just a choice to support the existing hegemony and power structure. They're supporting the regime, basically. Frank and Osbeck also point out that in many subjects, at least having a conversation about values seems to be a fundamental goal of school and education policy. And I think Rutenberg puts it quite well when she says that democracy really depends on having our students learn to read the social order, the society that they find themselves within political terms. And I think this activity is being inquiry based. I have faith in the unpredictability and the spontaneity of putting students in the community, having them verify some of these theoretical notions with firsthand accounts of people that they know, real life people that give real life stories and real life answers to the questions that have to do with building understanding and building connections and trying to build some kind of solidarity. With this in mind, it's really hard to see this activity as being one-sided or biased or ideologically based. So I'll conclude there. Hopefully you found this education plan and my discussion of Chantel Mouffe's concept of agonism useful and interesting. And thank you very much for listening.